Low dark grey clouds are floating over the snow-covered plain that goes to the horizon. Once in a while a dull, dim sun peeps through the gaps between them and immediately disappears again behind the murky shroud. A snowstorm is blowing. Its cold, prickly plumes are streaming along the snowdrifts, swinging over the high barrier and, exhausted, stop at our feet. For the second hour we have been firing incessantly, sending shells over the Don, to the place where the rumble of battle does not subside for a minute. The barrels of the guns are hot, sizzling from the Pozmochnaya grits falling on them. The crews are working without overcoats, and yet they are wearing overcoats that can be wrung out. At last the command to stop firing comes. Having torn myself away from the sight, I could hardly straighten my numb back. The crew gathered around the gun commander Sergeant Artemonov. Among us, only recently put on soldiers' gymnasies, Nikolai Igorovich stands out noticeably. He is slightly taller than average height, with an open, strong-willed face and most importantly with an enviable dressing of a cadre servant. Everyone's mood is excellent, you bet. We were in the first battle and came out of it without a single loss. Moreover, not a single shell or a single mine fell on our positions. The excited and joyful conversation was interrupted by another command: prepare to move. Quickly we put the gun in marching position, shrouded the barrel. The driver Vasily Kadoshnikov, a round-faced, good-natured guy, was pulling up the tractor. We chain the gun to it, load ammunition. The platoon commander, Junior Lieutenant Mikhail Kanalin, flushed in the January frost, comes up. He hurries us up. Hurry up, God of war. Time is running out. We stuffed the whole back of the truck with shells. The ones that don't fit, we attach to the front, to the frames. The numbers of the crew are placed on the lower battle board, who on the carriage. And now the tractor with a gun on the trailer was winding along the narrow road, laid right on the snowy virgin land. Soon they caught up with the infantry. They stopped. Sergeant Artemonov, falling almost waist-deep into the deep snow, ran to the head of the column, to the battery commander. From there he gave us the familiar signal unhitch. We unhitched the gun and rolled it to the indicated firing position. As soon as we overcame the steep slope of the hill, the commander of the gun crew commanded squad to battle. And he himself helped to bring our 76mm anti-tank gun into a fighting position. Then oriented. Straight the bend of the trench, to the left the machine gun. I fell down to the rubber eye cup of the panorama. I saw grey figures on the snow. It is in the dense bursts of shells. Under dense rifle and machine gun fire our infantry is making short runs to approach the enemy. Several men are already lying motionless. I guess wounded or killed. On the machine gun, shrapnel continues meanwhile Sergeant Artemonov. I'm hurriedly looking for a target. Here and there flashing flashes of bursts. Their multitude makes my eyes blurry. Try to determine where the damn machine gun, which must be destroyed in the first place. And then there are my hands. They seem to be cramped. What are you picking at? Shouts the sergeant. Suddenly the flames surged ahead. Tight wave of explosion hit the face. Shrapnel and lumps of frozen earth rattled on the shield. A nasty shiver seized his body, drops of sweat appeared on his forehead. And behind him, a disgruntled voice again. Well, caught the target. I didn't have time to answer, as the sergeant pushed me away not quite politely and fell to the eyepiece himself. Not sparing my ego, throws over my shoulder. Rastupa, where are you aiming? Spreading his legs wide, Artemonov takes hold of the handles of the lifting and rotating mechanisms and begins to turn them quickly. A shot rattles. A cloud of smoke rose above the berm of the enemy trench, where the flames of the bursts were beating. The fire stopped. Strong man, I look with admiration at the bent back of my commander. So shoot. Now already calmly, says the sergeant and retreats to his seat. This direct fire at the enemy was remembered to me in all details, and it happened on the left bank of the Don, on the bridgehead, where we, not yet shelled artillerymen, received our baptism of fire. For the third day, our second battery of the 1212th Fighter Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant L.I. Shvadlenko, supported the infantry offensive. It's getting evening. In front of us, another height. The enemy is entrenched on it. He fiercely snapped back. In the panorama lens a trench. There's a machine gun in it. My task is to suppress it. Near the machine gun, two in helmets. Clearly visible ribbed casing. At the cut of the barrel beats a flame. I took aim, pulled the trigger and missed. The machine gunners quickly changed position. Fire now flickers to the right. Aimed the gun again. I fired twice, and both times missed. Don't hurry, Artemon advises, aim more accurately. I understand it perfectly well myself. But, while I was making another adjustment, the Nazis had already moved to the third position. I was gripped by this duel, the desire to outwit the enemy at all costs. I threw off my clumsy mittens. The cold metal of the handles burned my fingers, but still it was more comfortable to work this way. And when the fire of the machine gun again scored in the center of the crosshairs of the panorama, he pressed the trigger. Then again. In the thinning smoke of the explosions there appeared a ruptured bumper, a machine gun thrown aside, and a shining helmet on the edge of the crater. Nearby rumbled shots of other guns. The excitement of the battle engulfed me and my comrades. The calculation acts collected and diligently. A characteristic detail, the guys a few days in battle and under enemy fire already behave calmly, confidently. So, the enemy machine gun is destroyed. Our infantry is rising at full height. We hear shouts of hurrah, grenades bursting. Soon the rifle chain hides behind the height, and Junior Lieutenant Kanalin runs up to us. On his skinny, a little cheekbone face there is genuine joy. Well done, Nosov, he shouts. The praise makes it seem even warmer. It's true that not only I, but the whole squad is to my credit for the accurate shooting. But our platoon commander considers the gunner the main figure. But my fingers are still frozen. I put them to my lips, trying to warm them with my breath. The junior lieutenant, looking at me, resolutely pulls off his gloves. White, made of rabbit down. Take them, he offers. My mother knitted them. I am at a loss. Is it comfortable? But the sergeant pushes me in the back. Take them. I hesitantly accept the gift. I pull on my hands the gloves that keep the lieutenant's warmth. I feel like in a stove in them. Our platoon commander is hot, and sometimes harsh, but fair. Even at the formation we noticed he encouraged the diligent as much as he could, and strictly charged the negligent. And now in the battle another trait of his character, caring. Roll the gun, soon ordered Sergeant Artemonov. The men of the regiment piled on the wheels, carriage, beds and began to push the gun to a new firing position. They rolled into a gully. It's not so windy here, but the cold is still crazy. It chills to the bone, though we are dressed quite warmly. We are wearing bike underwear, cotton overcoats, felt boots on our feet, ear flaps on our heads, under our helmets. The shell carrier Musa Ismagilov, a very modest and hard-working guy, is turning blue, beating a drum with his teeth. Maybe I can find shelter there, comrade commander, he suggested to the sergeant, pointing to some hilly slope. Artemonov is also cold. It's understandable the frost spares no one. He agrees. Musa runs straight to the snowy hill, goes around it, and waves his hand vigorously, inviting us. Led by the sergeant, we go down into the German dugout. In the dim light of a hand lamp we look around. On the floor lying chairs, a round ribbed box of gas mask. On the table is a telephone set in a leather case. There's a bed in the corner. You've made a good job of it. Hasanshin resents. They were probably going to spend the winter. And we just smoked them out. Let them dance in the cold, now grinned Kashutin. Soon the dugout is packed with so many people that it's impossible to return. Other calculations have arrived. They are looking at the enemy's front, dwelling with interest. They smoke, exchange remarks. One of the soldiers picks up some nickel-plated object from the floor and begins to examine it. There is a pop, like a shot from a toy gun. The inquisitive one cries out, clasps his hand. Blood drips on his overcoat. Dummy. It's good that only 2 fingers were severed, swears Yuri Kozlov. Dressing his wound, he could have been left without a head. At that moment, the door of the dugout opened wide. The candle flickered and went out from the cold jet. In the doorway, Junior Lieutenant Kanalin, who authorized to leave the firing lines, he asks imperiously. He waits for a pause, and, having received no answer, he commands get out. Now. Artillerymen reached for the exit. It's not very pleasant to shiver in the cold, but orders are orders, some of them cursed in their hearts. You can't tell in the dark. The junior lieutenant reacted instantly. Who's too smart? Approach. No one responded. There were no smart guys. Our platoon on the battery, not only respected for his rare diligence and love for his profession, but also feared. Generally available and caring, he at the same time was never with his subordinates for Panibrata. And now, having built a platoon near the tractor, Kanalin began to sharply reprimand us. But he didn't finish. Above the dugout, in which we had just warmed up, rose a column of earth, fire and smoke. Remember this too, the junior lieutenant pointed to a huge smoking crater. If only for another 5 minutes. In a word, not a step without my permission. But where can we get warm, comrade junior lieutenant? Kashutin appealed to him. I'll warm you up, reassured the platoon leader, and ordered to dismantle the tools. We complied with his order. He immediately gave each calculation a task. At the same time he explained, let's equip the dwelling in a frontline way, dig a snow hole. We worked quickly. In an hour in a snowdrift, tamped by steppe winds, they dug something like a room. The entrance was covered with a cloak tent. A hole was made in the ceiling, a chimney. They built a small fire. They threw powder and toot into it. It got warm, they even took off their overcoats. Sucking on a cigar, Ismagilov said with approval. Still, our commander is a clever one. He'll warm you up, Kashutin chuckled. I thought that our platoon was just lucky to have a commander. Our offensive seems to have stalled. They say that there are persistent battles in front of Ostrogosh Kerks. They're moving the battery from one section to another, and our calculation left without a tractor. The second night takes a position in the infantry fighting order. It's getting light. The frost is getting worse. We're shivering, huddled closer together. Are you alive, artilleryman? Suddenly someone's cold voice booms basistically. Sergeant Artemonov jumps up. We get up too. We see a group of people a little aside. And at our firing position stands a tall commander in a frost-covered cap and burqa. A Cossack indeed. For the completeness of the picture he only lacks a moustache. There is whitish frost on his thick, long eyelashes. It's a bit cold, Artemonov complained to him. My regiment's kitchen is in the beam. Get your breakfast, refuel and come forward with us, ordered the commander and marched towards the heights. Kasanshin, Kashutin, ordered the sergeant to find the kitchen, to provide the calculation with breakfast. The soldiers rushed to fulfill the order. They came back soon. They were wearing only coats without helmets, in their hands precious bundles. Life to the infantry. The usually reticent Kasanshin tells us in a talkative voice, we have hot food twice and 100 grams per brother. Regularly. But the petty officer, a stingy man, spoiled us. He says you're not ours, and whose are you, comrade sergeant? The question remained unanswered. Shakar, sniffing noisily, unfolded his overcoat, put a helmet with steaming porridge on the shell box. Kashutin next to him put a second one with tea. When both helmets were empty, it became warmer. And then the artillery preparation began. Shells and mines began to burst at the enemy positions. Smoke was billowing over the craters and, lazily rising up, melted in the frosty blue. Soon the rifle chain moved forward. We rolled the gun after it. But here some enemy firing point came to life. Our infantry lay down. The crew prepared to fire. Straight ahead a bush. To the right a bunker. The gun commander oriented me. I found this target quickly. Here it is, a snowy hillock. In the centre the socket embrasure. From there the machine gun is continuously firing. I also notice how several figures separated from the chain. Daredevils crawled to the bunker, leaving behind them in the snow deep furrows. Fire, sounded the command. I pressed the trigger. Smoke and snow dust cover the target, but the Nazi machine gun keeps firing. The sergeant makes a correction. Again I aim carefully. This time the shell hit the top of the hillock, raised a cloud of snow. Why are you smearing? Artemonov was upset. I myself was seized with frustration and anger. I tried to pull myself together to calm down, and as soon as the smoke cleared, I sent a third shell into the bunker. Right in the embrasure flame flashed. The fire stopped. It would be like that for a long time. The commander of the calculation calmed down. As soon as we destroyed the breach, the Nazis, shooting back, began to retreat. The firing chain got up, moved forward. Falling through the waist in the snow, the calculation also rolled the gun further. Sweat was streaming down our faces, our throats were dry and we were thirsty. It seemed that our strength was running out. And the sergeant kept hurrying. Faster, faster, guys. We're lagging behind the infantry. With great difficulty we overcame a snow-covered field, and then a gully with sparse bushes. At the ascent to the heights we were finally exhausted, and literally on anger alone they managed to move the gun to another firing position. Until evening we advanced together with the infantry, and still we fell behind. We got out on a well-travelled road. We stopped. The usual tension of battle was replaced by deadly fatigue. We couldn't move any further. The same regiment commander who provided us with breakfast in the morning helped us out. Well done, artilleryman, not in vain ate porridge. He praised us, having arrived with his staff. Then he ordered someone take the gun on the trailer. When it got dark, we reached the outskirts of Ostrogozhsk. They stopped at a ruined house. The sergeant sent Alexei Nikiforov to look for the battery. Soon Junior Lieutenant Kanalin came by car and jumped on Artemonov. Where have you been hanging around? I've been on the front line all day, looking for you. We were supporting the infantry. The sergeant replied with dignity. Then it's different, softened platoon. February day, rarely sunny and frosty. Our column, as it was explained to us, is moving in the direction of Belgorod. The road was cleared of snow by the efforts of the local population. To the right and left of it there are 2-meter snowdrifts. Monotonously humming engines of tractors, and snow crunching under the wheels of cars and guns. Suddenly a ringing howl of airplanes breaks into these familiar sounds. In the frosty air there is a deafening crackle of machine gun bursts. The cars stop. Soldiers jump out on the road, dive into snowdrifts. Fascist vultures twice fly over us. Then the rumble of their rumbling goes away. We got off lightly, Alexei Nikiforov says with relief, shaking off the snow from his cotton coat. Very much so, Kashutin agrees with him. It's good that we weren't bombed. Where is Izmagilov? Looking around at all of us, the sergeant asks perplexedly. He must have taken a nap, the driver Kadoknikov jokes nervously. Look for him, Artemonov orders me. Kasanshin and I move to the opposite side of the road. We see Izmagilov in the ditch. His face, which had been swarthy before, is now unbelievably white. On his chest, on the grey cloth of his overcoat, a dark cherry stain has spread. His eyes were open, but lifeless. Shocked by the death of a comrade, we stand, not knowing what to do. Kozlov comes to our rescue. Perhaps among us he is the youngest and the most well-read. That's why the battery commander appointed him temporarily to the post of a medical officer. If necessary, Yura can make a bandage, injection, give a cough pill. And now, having run up to us, he knelt down, took Izmagilov's hand, felt his pulse. And wrinkling his face as if from a toothache, he said, "That's it. He's gone. Report to the sergeant." I take this opportunity to run away. I can't see the dead. In addition to Ismagilov, there are other casualties in the battery. The driver was killed and 2 numbers wounded, and there's turmoil in the tail of the column. Several cars are on fire. Soldiers are throwing out their belongings. Start it up, a command crawled along the column. Lieutenant Cherdnichenko, the battery commander, is running from car to car. Stops near us, asks hopefully, "Who can drive?" We are silent. In the civilian life, it seems no one from our calculation was familiar with this technique. During the formation period, we studied only our specialty, so. Alexei Matveyevich holds his gaze for the longest time on Kashutin, the most broken and cheerful fighter, a jack of all trades. But even he only shrugs his shoulders and replies, "I was in charge of the mare, comrade lieutenant, but not the machine." "You will," firmly pronounces the battery commander, and in the meantime he himself climbs into the cabin of the orphaned tractor. This case on the front road ended quite unexpectedly. On the same day, from above came the order all personnel in 2 weeks to learn to drive a car. Our platoon commander, Junior Lieutenant Kanalin, did not like to put things off. He tried to fulfill any order precisely and on time. By the way, he taught this to his subordinates. After breakfast, the soldiers of the calculation gathered in the collective farmyard near the tractor. Driver Kadoshnikov, acting as an instructor, began with the theory. This machine has 50 horsepower. It is capable of transporting. "I matter," Kadoshnikov, Sergeant Artemonov interrupted the driver. "And you, let's get down to business. Show us where to stick what to press, how to steer. That's all. Why hurry?" The driver was surprised. "What if you get hurt in battle?" explained one of the fighters, not quite to the point. "Well, then it's a different matter." The driver was not offended in the least. He climbed into the cabin and began to explain. "We put the key in the lock, turn the ignition by turning to the right, like this. Understand? Start the engine. Is that clear too?" Entering his new role, our driver visibly revived. "To make the car move, you need to press your foot on the clutch pedal 1, then engage first gear 2. He was silent for a moment. Then he continued again. "Now the main thing, smoothly release the clutch pedal and at the same time give the gas. That's all the mechanics. Understand?" "I see." "And how to stop?" Nikiforov asked. "If it runs out of gas, it will stop on its own," grinned Kashutin. Our instructor did not pay the slightest attention to this remark. Pointing with his hands and wielding his foot, he continued to explain. To stop the car, must press the clutch pedal and simultaneously on the brake pedal. Then put the gear lever in neutral. Understand? For about an hour and a half we, of course, superficially familiarized ourselves with the basics of driving a car. After a break, Kadoshnikov suggested to start practical driving. He turned to Artemonov. "Comrade Sergeant, come to the cabin. You, as a commander, should set an example for your subordinates." "Don't command," the gun commander cut him short. "I'll do it myself. Who have we got here is very literate. Nikiforov Hasanshin. Come on, Shakar, show your art." The assistant gunner nimbly climbed into the cabin. The engine started, and suddenly it roared wildly at full speed. The tractor rushed forward, scattered us to the sides. "Stop, stop." "Where are you going?" shouted after Artemonov, shaking his fists. "Gas. Drop the gas, you rascal." Kadoshnikov, rising up, joined him. But of course Kazanshin heard nothing. The roar of the engine drowned out the voices. Meanwhile, the tractor was flying straight at the silo. Everyone fell silent in anxious anticipation. Only Kashutin wheezed. "It will hit no car, no tower." But the tractor suddenly turned to the right and got stuck in a snowdrift. We rushed to it. I wondered what had happened. Artemonov was the last to arrive. He tore open the cab door and said angrily, "Get out, chauffeur. You'll get wise in the kitchen." The pale Hasanshin only smiled stupidly and did not react to his words. "Are you deaf, boy?" The sergeant boiled up. "Who's under orders? Get out." I can't, stammered the soldier, frantically clutching the steering wheel. Kadoshnikov guessed, jumped up on the step, unclenched the numb fingers of the novice driver, rubbed them. As soon as I saw the tower, I forgot everything. Kasanshin justified himself after a minute. I tried to turn aside, and it was coming at me. I didn't know what to do. Only at the very last moment I remembered about the steering wheel. I turned the steering wheel, but lucky me. Otherwise I'd have been smashed to bits. Sergeant Artemonov, having listened to his story, ordered. You, Kadoshnikov, now also sit in the cab. Watch carefully and instruct how to do what to do. Got it? Or someone else will crash and I'll be responsible. February is coming to an end. The battery has been fighting for a month and a half. We've already got used to the inconveniences of front life, forced deprivations. We learned to doze sitting and standing, to build a fire in the snow, to cook food. Every day we gain combat experience, our ideas about the war are expanding. We remembered large population centres Belgorod, Kazakia Lopan, Bogotov, Grey-Voron. Destroyed cities and corpses of civilians cry out for revenge. We have heard about the barbarity of the fascists on our land. And yet each new atrocity resonates in our hearts with the sharpest pain. That day, overcoming snow drifts, the battery slowly moved forward. Toward evening the column stopped. Lieutenant Chernyshenko, taking out a map, began to consult with our platoon commander about something. While they were talking, the soldiers of the calculation jumped out of the body, began to warm themselves near the radiator. In the evening twilight ahead protruded stove pipes. All that remained of the village unknown to us. 200 meters away from the road there was a dark ditch, some kind of dwelling, some kind of cellar. Yuri Kozlov, now he is a gunner in our squad, takes leave of his sergeant and runs there. Not for the sake of curiosity, of course, but for business, to scout a suitable lodging, and maybe to get some food. The last days are getting tighter with the delivery of food, ammunition and fuel. Kozlov returns even faster. There is no face on him. He is silent for a long time, breathing heavily. Finally he shouts out. Perverts. Beasts. What did they do to the children, babies, the animals, and curses hard. No one pulls him back. Even the commander of the first gun, Sergeant Fyodor Simakov, who organically did not tolerate profanity, also keeps silent. Comrade Sergeant. Finally asked in a pleading tone Kozlov. Look what's there. And pulls Artemonov by the sleeve. Shining a hand flashlight, we went down into the cellar, which apparently served as a dwelling for someone. The greenish light flickers along the walls and the earthen floor. It stops in a corner. There lies a woman with her head crushed and her arms twisted. Next to her are children in their underwear. 3 of them. One beside the other. Babies, 2 to 6 years old. Face down. Blood clots on the whitish backs of their heads. Shot at point-blank range. One of the fighters groans and runs out of the dungeon. The others return grimly, with faces darkened with pain and anger. They climb into the back of the truck. They are silent. The frost is raging, and we're hot. We should hang them. The bastards. Kashutin gritted his teeth, clenching his pudgy fists in rage. Hang them. They spent the night on the road. In the morning we stopped in the village. The platoon explained they had run out of gasoline. That's how it is, the cars are at a standstill. Only stingy Kadoshnikov had stashed a canister of fuel. But it was discovered by the battery commander. Are you going alone? He struck our driver with a question. Take it. It's nothing. I just stopped up in case of fire. He shrugged his shoulders. Despite the early hour, we were surrounded by locals. They greedily ask us about the situation at the front. We tell them what we know. Keep chasing the damned fascists, they ask. To Berlin. And commanders, gathered around our tractor, solve a difficult problem: where to get fuel. Lieutenant Chernyshenko looks at the canister, ponders. I would still have 50 litres, even alcohol. We'd make it. There is alcohol, comrades, commanders, A grandfather suddenly echoed from the crowd. Only it is with fuel oil. It was left by the Germans. By order of the battery commander, the drivers took the empty containers and followed the grandfather. He was not exaggerating. On the outskirts of the village there was a tank half filled with alcohol. Half an hour later the drivers returned. Lieutenant Chernyshenko added gasoline from Kadoshnikov's canister to each tank. Now refuel, he ordered. Kashutin, who was dozing beside me, smelled the odor of alcohol and revived. He jumped out of the truck. Does it smell like bloody water? You guessed it, answered Kadoshnikov. Lend me the flask. I'll thank you forever, asked Semyon. I'd like to drink it myself, but I have to go, the driver muttered. Having learned about the commander's order, Kashutin was sincerely saddened. Wow, such a good thing ruined. As they say, a bucket of gasoline was poured into the honey cistern. But I'll take a ride with the wind, promised Kadoshnikov. 10 kilometers to Lebedin, I would cross the river in a crawl. And who will carry your gun? Kozlov couldn't stand it. In response, Kashutin sniffed his nose and silently climbed into the back. He realized that it was better to drive badly than to walk well. A gloomy March morning was dawning. The column turned off the highway and soon stopped. Sergeant Artemonov was called to the battery commander, and our platoon agitator Kozlov ran to the deputy regiment Major Mashevadin. Both returned soon enough. Artemonov built the calculation, gave the order. Fire position of the platoon at an unnamed height. The task to prevent a breakthrough of fascist tanks along the road. Our trench is on the left flank. On the right, the first calculation. On the left, the third. Main sector of fire, dark bush. Road bend, auxiliary shrubbery, gully. Got it. Private Nikiforov, repeat. What a man our commander is. In any situation does everything by the book. But maybe that's why every day we have more and more respect for him. Nikiforov repeated the task word for word. Is it clear to everyone? Artemonov asked again. Of course, answered Kozlov. Only the fascists near Kharkov are pressing. It seems to have broken through to the rear. What a piece of news. How long have we rejoiced at the defeat of the enemy at Stalingrad? We chased the fascists to the west, took part in the liberation of many villages and hamlets. And now? You're not confused by any chance, boy, doubted the sergeant. That's right. My deputy instructed me. He told me not to panic, not to be confused. The main thing is stamina. I see, nodded the head of the commander. Well, now let's get to work. The soldiers dismantled their tools and started to work. They chiseled the ground, hard as granite. Soon Kashutin threw the shovel, sat down on a dislodged lump of earth, tiredly said, Enough. We're going to retreat anyway. What makes you think so? Artemonov was surprised. So the fascists have broken through. How can we stop them now? Don't stir up panic. Kozlov was indignant. For such words you can freely get a pickaxe on your helmet. Are you crazy? What panic? Kashutin was stunned. I walked from Minsk to Moscow. I didn't panic. Can't you tell the truth? I mean, if the Nazis strike, what will we use to fight back? No shells, no food? Semyon, talk less and do more. The sergeant stopped Kashutin. Junior Lieutenant Kanalin came up. Cheerful trim. Dashingly sliding his helmet on the back of his head, he walked twice around our construction, half-voicedly humming ducks are flying, ducks and 2 geese are flying. He stopped. At half a word he cut off the melody. What are you digging? A trench or a mass grave? A trench. For whom? For yourself? Then make it your fortress. And then as long as at least one artilleryman is alive in the formation, fascist tanks will not pass through your position. The platoon leader threw off his coat, took the kurkumatiga in his hands, spread his shoulders, cheerfully commanded, Let's go. Faster. He worked so nimbly that a cloud of crumbs of frozen ground splashed in all directions. At each stroke, well-developed muscles were visibly bubbling under his overcoat. Infected by his energy, we also began to do the work that was already tiresome, but necessary and important at the front. We knew that the price for it was high life or death. Don't spare the sweat, cannoneers. Cannelin encouraged us in the meantime. The first calculation is already camouflaging its position, and you haven't dug a decent gap yet. But you were helping him, Artemonov justified himself. So you were waiting for me? Grinned Mikhail Georgievich. When the trench was half ready, the junior lieutenant left. Is our platoon's platoon leader a double-strung man? Alexei Nikiforov spoke warmly about him. He came for half an hour, and how much we did with him. Not two-fisted, but he knows what is the main thing in battle, replied the gun commander. And what is the main thing? Kozlov tried to clarify. Artemonov did not answer. He took off his helmet and listened. We followed his example. Somewhere up in the air was the engine of an airplane. Stop work. Disguise the trenches. A command sounded. Above our defences appeared frame a fascist reconnaissance plane, nicknamed so by the Frontline soldiers for the unusual nature of its design. It circled above us for a short time and flew away. Now wait for guests, Kashutin muttered glumly. You guessed it. After a while the cross-bombers appeared. The men of the regiment took cover in the gap, and I remained standing, watching as 12 fascist planes, just a little before reaching our high rise, rushed into a dive. Bombs flew down with a soul-destroying screech. Get down. Are you fed up with life? Pulled me by my overcoat, Sergeant. I fell to the bottom of the crevice. My heart was pounding. The ground shook, and there was a deafening explosion nearby. Our trench, as if alive, moved. Then another and another. Finally the bombers flew away. The soldiers began to rise to shake off, height in craters of craters. The snow, mixed with earth, blackened. Next to us a deep pit. Above it smokestack, ashy smoke. I wish it had hit our trench, I thought anxiously, feeling an unpleasant chill under my spine. Alive? All right? Lieutenant Chernyshenko asked me on the run. Everything is all right, Artemonov answered for everyone. However, in general, the battery was unlucky. One section is completely out of action, and the cannon too. No sooner had they cleaned themselves up, when again it rumbled the artillery shelling began. Something unimaginable was going on around. Shells and mines were bursting thickly. The height was drowned in clouds of smoke. The bursts were still rumbling, and the numbers had already taken their places at the gun. In the field of view of the panorama you can clearly see how the enemy infantry turned on both sides of the road, going to converge. Behind them, moving armoured personnel carriers. Reference point 2 gave the command sergeant armoured personnel carrier. Hurriedly working the mechanisms, I try to aim at one of the vehicles. But it merges with the surrounding background, then disappears, then reappears. Finally I managed to catch it in the crosshairs. Shot, 2 more in a row. The armoured personnel carrier burst into flames. 3 other vehicles were hit by neighbouring units. The others began to withdraw. The infantry lay low. The first enemy onslaught was repulsed. And again shells and mines fell on the height. Carrier Kashutin cried out softly, dropped to the snow, carefully put a shell next to him, took hold of his leg. Greying face expressed pain and suffering. Compared to us almost boys, Semyon is a man of age. He is already in his 30s. He has an oddity. When he went to bed, he furtively baptized. He's a believer. And now, sitting on the snow and bandaging his wounded leg, he too is whispering something. Either he's praying or he's bashing the Almighty. We have already noticed, having seen the horrors of war, Kashutin has recently cooled down considerably to the Lord God. Only we carried the wounded man to the car, as the battery was ordered to change the firing position. At full speed we sped 10 kilometers, drove up to the river. We crossed the bridge to the opposite bank. We stopped on a slope. unchecked the guns, began to prepare new trenches. It was getting evening. A fog hovered over the river, and in this wary silence we suddenly heard a muffled noise of engines. Soon a column appeared on the road, on the other bank motorcycles, tanks, cars, fascists. Lieutenant Chernyshenko went around the calculations, set the task to destroy the bridge. The battery opened fire. They hit the piles. The enemy column began to turn into battle order. Several tanks separated from it. Having overtaken the motorcyclists, they rushed to the bridge. Here already the tracks of the head tank rumbled on the decking. But before our eyes, the middle span of the bridge began to slowly settle. Then it broke apart altogether. The tank collapsed, broke through the ice, and disappeared under water. Others stopped on the shore and fired at our firing positions. That day the enemy failed to force the water barrier. In the middle of the night we were raised by the platoon commander's command. Gun to the front. "Shall we withdraw, Comrade Junior Lieutenant?" Nikiforov inquired. "Things are not good near Bogokov," Kanalin briefly explained. By his worried face, our hasty gathering, finally, even by the fact that we were leaving another favourable frontier, it was easy to guess that there was really trouble at the front. We went on our way. In the morning we caught up with a small column of infantry. We stopped. Lieutenant Chernyshenko consulted with its commander about something. 3 men approached our car. We squeezed, put the infantrymen on the boxes with shells. Their faces darkened from fatigue. Their overcoats were dirty. On their feet, not in season, felt boots thawed in the daytime. There was mud on the roads. We began to look for fellow countrymen. There were none. "Would you like something to chew on?" The cheekbone soldier asked incredulously. "It's the 3rd day on starvation rations." "Friendship is friendship, but breadcrumbs apart," muttered our new shell carrier Shutov. "Don't be greedy, give him a treat," ordered Artemonov. Shutov, frowning unhappily, untied a common duffel bag with food, gave each infantryman a couple of breadcrumbs and a large piece of sugar. A broad-chested sergeant with a bandaged head, chewing on a breadcrumb with a bit of soot, envied him. "Artillerymen are fine, they march on wheels all the time. But what's it like for us? During the night you get so worn out that your heels burn." We kept silent. Each of us sincerely sympathized with our fighting comrades, humble toilers of the war. After all, in any battle you feel much more confident when you see infantrymen beside you. You know that they will not leave you in trouble. And we, artillerymen, were always ready to come to their aid. At dawn we passed Bogokov, then a big village. It was especially memorable Krasino. On its outskirts we left infantrymen. And we turned off the highway and drove along a country road. They came to the crest of some hillside. Here we unhitched the guns. "Quickly prepare the trenches," Junior Lieutenant Kanalin hurried us. But we still did not have time to equip our positions. A column appeared in the distance. It was getting closer by the minute. Lieutenant Chernyshenko looked through binoculars for a long time, and suddenly he commanded, "Tanks on the right, battery to the battle." The numbers of calculations took their places. In the meantime, the Nazi tanks had already crawled up the far slope and opened fire. Shells whistled above us. "Get down," shouted Sergeant Artemonov. He himself continued to stay to the right of the gun, watching the enemy. Suddenly an explosion rumbled right in front of him. The sergeant fell down, bleeding. We rushed to him. But Artemonov stopped us. "Squad, to the gun. Don't let the tanks through." It was the last order of our commander, and we fulfilled it, went back to the gun. The tanks were approaching, but soon, having lost one car, the fascists withdrew behind the ridge, and there, under its cover, began to go around the ravine to attack us from the flank. 7 armoured monsters rushed to the position of the first calculation, led by Senior Sergeant Fedor Simakov. The artillerymen courageously entered the unequal fight. The first tank caught fire, but the calculation also suffered losses. 1 soldier was killed, and 2 others were wounded. The gun commander himself stood at the site. He stopped the second tank with an accurate shot, and then the explosion threw the senior sergeant away from the gun, covered with earth. When he woke up, he rushed to the gun again and fired. One more car went up in flames. The others began to withdraw. Here, near Crisino, our pupil, and now the gunner of another calculation, Shakar Hasanshin, distinguished himself. Already at the very beginning of the battle he was wounded, but continued to fire. A shell exploded nearby. Shakar was wounded again. Other numbers of the calculation also dropped out of formation. And then, overcoming the hellish pain, Hasanshin himself loaded the gun, took aim and fired. The tank, which had broken forward, stopped, then went up in smoke. The other two, shooting back, moved away. In the battle near Crisino we destroyed 10 enemy vehicles, but we also suffered heavy losses. Only 2 serviceable guns were left in the battery. Several days in a row we withdrew. At night we made a march, and in the morning at a favourable line of defence, repelled enemy attacks. In the evening we again folded up and again withdrew. The mood of those days is difficult to convey in words. I know from myself that there is perhaps nothing more bitter than to leave the native land that we had just conquered from the enemy. At dawn we reached the outskirts of a large village. Its name was etched in my memory, Cherkaskoy. They began to equip a position in the vegetable garden. From the experience and fatigue I felt dizzy and sleepy. I sat down on the frame, and as if fell into the abyss. Junior Lieutenant Kanalin woke me up. He pointed with his hand at the distant hillside, bare of snow. Nazi tanks were crawling up it. The muffled murmur of their engines was already heard. From gun to gun walked the regiment commander. Tall, trim. Calm voice encouraged the few calculations. Fire more accurately. Save shells. Major Nikulin, a man rarely demanding. I remember even in the period of formation with him I had one unpleasant incident. Then, busy equipping a machine gun disc, I did not pay attention to those who entered the house, where our calculation. Besides, the case was not going well. I was nervous. "What are you doing, comrade fighter?" I heard from behind. "Can't you see, can't you?" I answered unfriendly, without turning around. "Stand up," followed by an imperious shout. "The cartridges will scatter," for bickering 2 detachments out of turn. The major determined the measure of punishment. From that time the regiment commander obviously remembered me, for when I met him he would always ask, "Well, what will make you happy, Godson?" And now, stopping near our gun, he asked, "How's your mood, Nosov?" "Cheerful," I answered. "Do you know the task?" "One task, Comrade Major, to beat the enemy." "Remember that much depends on the gunner," said the regiment commander. He stopped and suddenly added, "Take care of yourself." Meanwhile, the tanks took the battle order and opened fire. The first shell knocked out the calculation of the neighbouring gun, mangled the cannon. At that time a liaison came running from the regiment commander and passed the order to gather the artillerymen who were left without guns and to take defence with them on the outskirts of the village. This task was entrusted to our platoon commander. About the only gun of the battery remained me and Lieutenant Chernyshenko, and in the shelter behind the barn was in the tractor driver Kadoshnikov. Kozlov, Nikiforov and Shutov also left with the junior lieutenant. Fortunately, the fascist tanks did not risk to attack us through the ravine and turned back. The roar of their engines gradually quieted down, getting farther away, but on the opposite outskirts of the village suddenly broke out a desperate shelling. "All a tractor," ordered Chernyshenko. I rushed to where the car was parked, called Kadoshnikov. For some reason he was silent. The battery commander ran up to me, shouted, "Kadoshnikov, start." Again silence. Then Chernyshenko tore the door of the cabin. The chauffeur slowly fell at his feet. A pale, waxy face distorted by a grimace of frozen pain caught his eye. We carried the dead driver to the back of the truck. I got behind the wheel, brought the tractor to the firing position. Together with the lieutenant we hitched up the gun and raced down the street. Behind the village there was a battle. A dozen tanks attacked the positions of our infantry. We turned the gun around. Lieutenant Chernyshenko stood behind the gunner. He fired twice. One car went up in flames. I fired 3 more shots. We ran out of shells. My battery commander with trembling hands pulled out a tiny cigarette butt from behind the lapel of his ear flap. He lit it, took 2 greedy puffs, handed it to me. "That's it, Nosov. The ball is over. But we'll be back here again," he promised firmly. The gun must be saved. The infantry, left without fire support, slowly retreated. I rushed to the tractor, but it was already on fire, hit by an enemy shell. The situation was critical. However, the lieutenant even here did not lose his presence of mind. He went around the gun, for some reason stroked it on the carriage, and ordered in a trembling voice, "Give me a grenade." He took a lemonade from my hands, inserted the fuse and shoved the grenade into the barrel. There was an explosion. After that we took out the bolt, seized the panorama and began to withdraw together with the infantrymen. Lieutenant Chernyshenko walked slouchingly, hid from me suspiciously moistened eyes. No, our commander was not a sentimental man, but obviously for him the death of his comrades and the loss of all the guns meant a lot. Spring was coming to an end. The summer of the 43rd year was approaching. Forests, meadows and fields were green all around. Cherry orchards were dressed with white boiling. In the cloudless sky the larks were singing their intricate trills. For more than a month our regiment is in the rear. We are located in a camp near the village of Kursk 20 kilometers from Stary-Oskol. The units were replenished with people and equipment. Artillery units received new anti-tank guns. Every day, from rising to going to work, is a tense training. Today the battery commander came to the lesson, Lieutenant Chernyshenko. Called me out of the ranks and announced the order of appointment as a gun commander. I must admit that at first I was even confused by such an unexpected promotion. Maybe that's why I didn't immediately realize what to answer in such cases. I just thought anxiously, will I be able to cope after all? There were 7 men in the formation, and in addition, an anti-tank gun, a foreign brand tractor. There'll be a dozen or so tools alone. That's a lot. "Take command, Ivan Stepanovich." Meanwhile, the battery commander gave me a friendly admonition. And, as if guessing my thoughts, added, "You'll manage, not God's burn pots." I do not need to look at my subordinates. After all, in this calculation was listed on the staff schedule, had lunch at the same table. And yet, when I looked up at my comrades, immediately felt their tenacious, wary eyes. Here stands on the right flank Assistant Gunner Vladimir Sevastyanov, a notable guy, tall, with a thin waist and broad shoulders. He knows his job well, he copes well with other duties. Next to him is the loader Alexander Bayanov, an inquisitive, cheerful fighter. He knows how to joke, but without jokes. That's why few people take offense at him. To the left is the installer Alexei Bezobotnov, the oldest and most judicious soldier of the battery. His opinion is listened to not only by privates, but also by sergeants. Almost twice as old as many of us, he is universally respected. That's why they call him respectfully Alexei Ivanovich. Unperturbed and somewhat slow, he at the same time does everything thoroughly, on conscience. But his crony Peter Bondarenko is rarely hot, unbalanced, starts up, as they say, with half a turn, and treats his duties with laziness. A little farther away stands my fellow countryman Yuri Kozlov. We were drafted into the army at the same time. At first we served in the same unit. Then for a while our paths diverged. He was temporarily acting as a sanitary instructor, and I was assigned to the cook. A mechanic of one of the factories of Vladimir region, he seemed to be able to do everything. Excellent knowledge of small arms, anti-tank gun. Not bad drawings, was even an agitator, issued a combat leaflet. The driver, Peter Degtyarov, a hard-working guy who knows the machine well, closes the line. A true frontline labourer chauffeur. I must say that the battery commander has wisely completed our calculation. 4 soldiers have already been in the battles. The guys are reliable. And the other 3 are also like them, diligently learning, eagerly adopting experience. In a word, with them, as they say, you can go scouting. When Lieutenant Chernyshenko withdrew to a respectable distance, I waspsy with excitement voice gave my first command. A smoke break. The soldiers surrounded me. They congratulated me. Bondarenko squeezed through. He patted me on the shoulder and remarked snidely, "Go ahead, Vanya. By the end of the war, you'll earn stars on your epaulettes." "Sergeant Artemonov has no use for you," Kozlov sneered at him. For such words he would have scolded him. Alexei Ivanovich acted more decisively. He put his arm around his friend's shoulders and said, as if jokingly, "If you say such a silly thing again, I'll pat you on the back with a bannock." Bezobotnov and Bondarenko stepped aside. It is not known what they talked about, but since then, none of the men of the unit have tried to joke about my promotion. And in one more important matter supported me Alexei Ivanovich. At first I felt somehow awkward giving him, an elderly fighter, orders. He noticed this state of mine, and once said in front of everyone, "You, Ivan, don't be shy, command me. I am a soldier, you are the commander. Your business is to give orders, ours is to fulfill them." That's the meaning of service. After the memorable battle near the village of Cherkaskoye, Junior Lieutenant Kanalin was first considered missing in the regiment, but he still managed to get through the enemy barricades and lead out the remaining artillerymen with him. He was promoted, appointed deputy commander of the battery on the structure part. But our platoon Mikhail Georgievich still did not forget. Obviously, every commander retains, if not even love, then at least, affection for his first unit, in which his formation began. That's why Kapelin often attended our classes, taught me in fighters' calculations of what is necessary in battle. And he knew a lot. After all, in his time he was also a gun commander. At the front of the first days of the war, he was wounded. After recovery in the hospital, he completed a course of junior lieutenants. And again the front. On one of May days we were engaged in engineering training. Kanalin came up and asked me unhappily, "What kind of a crow's nest have you built? The dimensions are not correct, and the camouflage is no good either." He reprimanded the soldiers for negligence, and me for being undemanding. "Dig the trench again," ordered the junior lieutenant. "I'm timing you." I repeatedly made a tracing of the trench, determined to each number the amount of work. The soldiers began to equip it. In the presence of the deputy commander, the work was going well. "Brosler and rear traverse camouflage," ordered Kanalin. Bondarenko brought a few sods. With a swing he threw them on the crest of the barrier, then began to lay them. "Don't you know the order of sodding?" The junior lieutenant stopped him. "Where do you start from?" "We haven't studied it." The fighter began to justify himself. "Look," Kanalin loosened his belt and stood in Bondarenko's place. They put it from the bottom of the bunker. The sods are pressed tightly against each other, like bricks against the wall. Having finished the work, he moved some distance away, satisfied with the remark. "Now, no enemy will not detect." After a break, the classes resumed. "Now let's see what you have learned from the fire service," said the junior lieutenant and gave a command to fight. The men began to fulfill their duties. Kanalij crouched on the berm, squinted his eyes and watched their actions. At first he wrinkled his nose in annoyance, and finally he couldn't stand it. "You're like at a funeral. We should work faster. The enemy in battle will not allow you to dig around like that." The junior lieutenant nimbly jumped up, went to the gun, and skillfully showed the methods of action of each number. Then he started practicing again. In 5 minutes we were soaking wet. But he, having entered into excitement, gave one command after another to battle, fire, stand down. When, in his opinion, the soldiers began to fulfill their functions more or less tolerably, he ordered, "Fire position in front. Roll the gun." We rolled the anti-tank gun to the verdant heights, and then a bird fluttered out from under our feet. Sevastianov bent under the undercarriage and exclaimed in surprise, "What an accident! Wow!" There was a nest in a deep horse track. There were 5 fledglings, not yet fledged. Tiny lumps were swarming, stretching out their necks, squeaking demandingly. "Why are they stuck?" Kanalin asked. "There are larks here," answered Alexei Ivanovich. "What nonsense. What larks?" "Honest." "There are chicks there," explained Yuri Kozlov. The junior lieutenant came to the gun, sat down, took a long and careful look at the fluffy lumps. "Move to the right," he finally said, and added, "How many nests, be she evil, has the warrior ruined?" The warriors obeyed this order eagerly, and the training continued. At last Kanalin left. We had already decided to finish the lesson, as Alexander Boyanov, who was characterized by sharp eyesight, grumbled unhappily. "It seems that some bosses have come again." Several cars came to us. I built a formation, reported to the general, who approached. "How is the private?" He was surprised. "A gun commander and a private. It's rare to find such a thing in artillery. Did you hit tanks?" "That's right." "That's right. And a private." "That's not right. We'll fix it." The evening inspection Petty Officer Kiselev read out the order on awarding me the military rank of Efreator. One of the classes with the platoon was conducted by the chief of ammunition of the regiment. He spoke in detail about the device of a shell of unusual design. According to him, it seemed that such a shell could penetrate the armor of any tank. Some did not believe it. An argument broke out. "All this is nothing but artistic whistling," Bondarenko said in his usual manner. "I also think so, that no shell tiger, for example, will not take," supported him one of the fighters. "It's possible that an ordinary armor-piercing shell won't take it," Kozlov proved, "but a sub-caliber one, be calm, it will pierce through and even deeper." "Fuck you, Yura, with your sub-caliber." Bondarenko was getting hot. 10 centimeters of steel to penetrate. Sorry, I don't believe it. "Don't apologize, Comrade Bondarenko," the battery commander who came up interrupted the argument. "Soon you will see for yourself the power of this shell." Lieutenant Chernyshenko kept his word. At night we were raised on alarm and were taken to the range. Here stood a German tank of TIV brand. Obviously the Nazis abandoned it in winter, in their hasty escape. And now our command used this captured machine for training purposes. We've been here many times. We practiced aiming techniques, aiming at the sides, tracks, engine part. And this night, having made a march, the battery stopped at the edge of a small wood. Our calculation was to shoot first. The driver Decharev did not fail. On the off-road he jumped to the heights, dashingly turned the tractor. The crew unhooked the gun in a flash and prepared to fire. We were all very excited, and because we were the first to fire in the battery, and because the new regiment commander, Major N.I. Ortiuski, was watching us. On the trophy tank the calculation fired 3 shots, and after that the whole battery was taken to see the results of our shooting. On the frontal armor of the machine, reinforced with steel plates, gaped 3 holes. "What a shell, what a force," admired Yuri Kozlov. "Now we are not afraid of any beast we can take on, a tiger or a panther." "This is a sub-caliber." Having touched the armor, Gunner Sevastianov joined the conversation. "You have to understand." "Here you are, boy, and artistic whistling." Alexei Ivanovich gave his friend Bondarenko a nudge. "Do you believe it now?" Yes, he agreed, scratching the back of his head. They must have been telling the truth. A few days later, the battery again went to the range. This time the calculations fired at a target moving at the speed of a tank. We fulfilled the task only satisfactorily, and the neighbours who achieved a higher grade went very pleased with themselves. "They didn't eat enough porridge to compete with us," laughed the commander of the 3rd gun, Senior Sergeant Ovchar. Junior Lieutenant Kanalin suddenly stood up for us. "Count chickens in the fall," he said. "This is not a battle yet. Let's see how you will act when shells and mines begin to burst around and tanks will come to the position." The offenders left us in peace. Only at the end of June the regiment left the camp. By several night passages we approached the front. We occupied an anti-tank area and began to equip it. We dug trenches for guns, slits for people, cellars for ammunition. All this was carefully camouflaged. However, they did not stay in place for long. At night they changed firing positions, and again we had to do fortification works. Then 3 more times we were moved to new lines. We got bloody calluses on our palms from shovels. Did the bosses decide to dig up all the Kursk land, grumbled some of the fighters. But they were wrong. Subsequent events showed that strong engineering structures are the key to success in a defensive battle. We entered the battle on July 6th, and the day before, all day in front of us, behind the distant hills, rumbled silently. Clouds of smoke were billowing and whining in that direction, covering the horizon, and sometimes even the sun. In the sky, every now and then, fierce air battles broke out. The soldiers of the calculation languished in a trench, covered with branches and camouflage net. They were having an uncomplicated conversation, jumping from topic to topic. But when the rumble of battle began to approach, it entered a directed direction. Pyotr Bondarenko was the first to say with anxiety in his voice, "It must be that the fascists are crowding ours." "It can't be," Alexander Boyanov objected to him. "We will endure." "It's not 41st now," Yuri Kozlov said with conviction. "And we will go forward, you'll see." Of course, in those days we, the soldiers, did not know the entire plan of the Soviet command to defeat the Nazi troops in the Kursk Bulge. It became known much later. But even then, each of us understood that the battle that had begun played a huge, if not even decisive role for the fate of the war, and therefore we were ready to fulfill our military duty to the end. Under the wind came the order to move out. The driver Dekjarev brought up a tractor. We attached the gun. The battery started on the way, approaching the front edge by beams and woods. It could be guessed by the glow of fires, the increasing noise of the battle. We stopped in a gully, camouflaged in the shrubbery tractors and guns. Lieutenant Chernyshenko gathered the commanders of platoons and calculations, led behind him. Short runs to the heights, lay down. It was still quite light, although the sun was already hidden behind the horizon. In front we could see guns under camouflage nets, dark green turrets of tanks dug into the ground. Faintly darkened twists of 2 trenches quite skillfully inscribed in the terrain. The battery commander pointed out our landmarks and gave us a combat order. From it became known that the enemy did cut into our defence. Therefore we had to urgently take up firing positions in an important, tank-dangerous direction. Having returned, we got down to business. The calculations worked quickly and silently, realizing that time was running out. And yet the platoon commander, Junior Lieutenant Miniev, was hurrying up. A gaunt, slightly above average height, he, working together with us, shouted incessantly in a low voice. Hurry up, brothers. Private Bondarenko, don't be lazy." "I'm already soapy," he answered. "More sweat, less blood," instructed the platoon leader. "That's so," Alexei Ivanovich intervened in the conversation. "But what if tomorrow they order us to withdraw?" "No," answered the junior lieutenant firmly. "There will be no retreat. The order is to defend and hold out." That short summer night, the men of my calculation not only did not sleep a wink, but never had a smoke break. They worked, as they call it, without bending their backs. The trench was equipped in record time in 4 hours. We rolled the gun into it, camouflaged it. Ammunition was laid out in niches, shells separately, small arms cartridges and grenades separately. When it became noticeably lighter, the soldiers with increased interest began to look at everything made by the battery during the night. "Well, now the fascists will never be able to pull us off this line," Alexei Ivanovich said with conviction. And with this he expressed the opinion of each of us. Above the horizon slowly rose a bright red disk of the sun. The soldiers took cover in the crevice. And before that Kozlov ran to the gully, picked a bunch of grass, brought it here. And now, inhaling the smell of overripe flowers, he told me. "At this time we are in the middle of haymaking. When you go out into the floodplain, your eyes run wild. The meadow is like your variegated carpet. While listening to him, I was simultaneously studying the nearby terrain through the bunker. It's a job description. It is important for the commander of an anti-tank gun to know from what direction tanks can attack, on what line to meet them, and with what aim it is better to fire. I notice everything. There on the right side of the hill nestles the village of Dubrava. From it stretches a deep ravine, covering the flank of our battery. On the left is the road. In some places its bed is torn up by funnels, and on a berm it is cut by a trench. For some reason a bridge has been thrown over it. Behind the road is a grove. The trees at the edge of the grove are disfigured by the bombing. "Take cover," suddenly sounded a command, and in a minute fascist bombers hovered over our height. They dropped bombs. The blast wave tore off our camouflage net and threw it on the gun barrel. Kozlov jumped out of hiding, corrected it. He came back and reported. The village was bombed to pieces. I remembered that I'd forgotten to set up an observer. I ordered the castle's Buyanov to perform this service. The soldier got up, leaned against the berm, and began to watch. Nearby there was a deafening rumble. Sand and clods of earth fell on us. My head rang. The acrid smoke took my breath away. Vladimir Sevastyanov dazedly twisted his head, shouted, "I can't hear well. My ears are blocked." "Open your mouth wider, Yuri Kozlov," advised him either jokingly or seriously. "I've already swallowed enough earth. I'll be spitting up for 24 hours. Unexpectedly, Junior Lieutenant Miniev appeared. We've never seen him so worried. One cheek clean-shaven, the other soapy. "Everybody alive, Nosov?" Sliding down the slit, he asked, breathing heavily. "So far, Comrade Junior Lieutenant." Only later did we find out why the platoon commander came running to us. It turns out that from the battery observation post noticed how near our trench bomb exploded. And so, risking his life, the platoon leader rushed here under the bombardment to check if the worst had happened. "Well, as long as there is order here," he said after taking a breath, "I'll look at the second calculation." The airplanes had not yet left when the artillery preparation began. It lasted about 20 minutes, and as soon as it began to quiet down, we rolled the guns out to the site, took our places. The slopes of the heights were literally ploughed over with craters. Dubrava was burning in the distance. "Tanks, Commander," warned Bayanov. Through the veil of smoke and dust, I see how on the distant hills crawl clumsy steel boxes. Having overcome the crests, they descend down the gentle slopes. I can already hear the approaching rumble of their engines. The bastards are going dashing. Alexei Ivanovich squinted his eyes and said, "As if on parade." "Nothing. Now we'll meet them," promised Yuri Kozlov. "It will be less dashing at once." Above us, whistling through the air, flew ill. Having made a combat turn, they began the assault. A few Nazi tanks went up in flames, but the rest continued to move forward. Looking into the impending steel avalanche, with every minute I feel the growing excitement. My heart beats hard and rumbling, blood pounding in my temples. The decisive minute is coming. Here already tanks and self-propelled vehicles descended into the ravine. In our sector there are 8 vehicles. 3 in the first line, 2 in the second and 3 more in the third. They are crawling, leaving behind them thick plumes of smoke and dust. From time to time I glance to my left at the focused face of the platoon commander. I wait for his signal. At the same time I think of a landmark in my mind, choose a tank, mark the aiming point. In frontal movement it is the center of the target. The shell, of course, is armor-piercing. Finally, Junior Lieutenant Miniev gives the command to open fire. Now I'm waiting for the tank I've chosen to come out of the ravine, and as soon as the steel machine crawls on the crest of the hill, I command. Fire. A sheaf of flame bursts out of the muzzle. The shell, drilling the air, is carried away towards the target. Well now. Overflight. 200 meters, Sevastyanov reported. That's a shame. I made a correction. Another shot. Now the rupture is in front of the car. I order not to change the sight. The The tank approaching on the front will shorten the distance itself. And indeed, the third shell hit the target. Tiger twitched, went in a circle, spreading on the ground broken caterpillar. Our gunner was not confused, slammed 2 more shells into his side. "The fascist is burning," shouted Buganov in a voice bursting with joy. But despite the losses, the tanks are still creeping to our positions. And then they hit a minefield. Several vehicles are blown up, others burst into flames from accurate gunshots. Nerves of fascist soldiers can't stand. Tanks, shooting back, begin to withdraw. So the Nazis, having lost several tanks and self-propelled vehicles, withdrew, but they did not give up their intention to crush our defence. Again began a massive artillery and mortar fire. Frequent columns of bursts danced across the heights. "Great beating," said Kozlov. "Fascists went crazy after the failure," added Bayanov. Nearby there was a double rumble. The wall of the trench collapsed, we were covered with earth. Soldiers from Simakov's calculation, who were in the neighbourhood, helped us out. Bondarenko was the last to be dug up. "A mouthful of earth, spitting up," he said, and sat down on the edge of the funnel. "It should be closed," advised Bayanov. "I don't understand you," Pet took offence. "One advises open, the other close." But then the artillery shelling stopped. There was a wary silence. One could hear tank engines rumbling somewhere. Lieutenant Chernyshenko came to our position through the labyrinth of passages. He said hello. He looked around, noticed the destruction, asked, "Do you get any?" "A little." "Sorry." The lieutenant piled his chest on the bumper, brought binoculars to his eyes, began to observe. Briefly threw over his shoulder. "They're coming again." "I can't see, Comrade Lieutenant." "Take it he gave me his binoculars, but learn to use them. Don't demask your position." I gladly accepted the commander's gift, brought it to my eyes. Yes, they are really coming. In 3 lines. In front of the squat tanks were the characteristic long-barreled gun Tigers, behind them self-propelled guns, and behind the medium tanks. "Get ready, Nosov. Now the most important thing will begin." That first attack was a sort of reconnaissance. The lieutenant was silent for a second, then added, "Let them get as close as possible and hit them at point-blank range. And don't take a step back." Hurriedly left to the other calculations. The first line of enemy vehicles had already overcome their front line. Hitler's infantrymen are jumping out of trenches and running after the tanks. The lieutenant is right. Now the most important thing will begin. There are so many tanks you can't count them at once. The neighbouring guns have opened fire. There's a continuous rumble on the battery. It's hard to even make out the voices. Our calculation also began to fire at the oncoming enemy vehicles. Through binoculars you can see how one of the shells hit the forehead of the Tiger, spewed out a sheaf of sparks and ricocheted. The enemy must have detected our gun. Explosions are frequent around. But the numbers continue to fulfill their task. Even Bondarenko calmly wipes the shells. Suddenly a flame flashed nearby. Something hot burned my cheek. I could hardly stand on my feet. At the firing position, smoke and dust. When they dispersed, there was no one at the gun. But now the gunner and loader jumped up from the ground, rushed to their places. The last one was Bujanov. Greedily gulping air, he turned his head dazedly and, stammering, said, "I thought my head was blown off." He smiled, obviously from the consciousness that he was alive. But immediately he turned pale, grabbed his shoulder, and slowly sank to the ground. "What's the matter with you?" Kozlov rushed to him. "I think I'm wounded." "Take cover, Bayanov," I ordered. Kozlov helped his comrade to get to the gap, carefully go down. The battery repulsed this attack. I went to Bayanov. The soldier was sitting at the bottom of the trench, leaning with his back against the wall. Pale, gaunt. The battery instructor was busy around him. Having finished bandaging him, he looked at me carefully and asked me sympathetically, "Does it hurt, Nosov?" "What hurts?" The wound on your face. Only then I remembered about the burn during the shelling and touched my cheek. There was blood on my fingers. So it really scratched. Kizelev immediately treated the wound, put a band-aid on it. Promised. It'll heal before the wedding. Of course it will heal. It's not much of a wound, more like a scratch. But Bujanov will have to be sent to the rear. It's a pity to lose such an assistant gunner, but what can you do? He's got to heal. But we didn't have time to send Bayanov back. Enemy aviation struck again. Then the shelling began. Then the enemy tanks and infantry attacked for the third time. Time seemed to stop for us. The battle was hushed, then flared up with a new force. The continuous rumbling made my ears ring and my head ached. My throat was dry and I was very thirsty. We repulsed another, I think the fourth attack. After waiting for the rebound, Kozlov took off his helmet and stretched out right by the gun. Sevastyanov was next to him. "Don't brag," Bezobotnov shouted to them. "You'd better get into the gap with us, or you'll be in for a surprise." They followed his advice. Sevastyanov, nodding his head in the direction of the enemy, said with evident surprise, "Look, Commander, we his tanks already 12.5 pounded, and he is still climbing. And where did he get so much equipment?" "All of Europe robbed," preempted my answer, Kozlov, "so there is nothing to be surprised. This metal could be melted down into tractors." Hiding a cigarette in his fist, Alexey Ivanovich said, "It would be a great help to the collective farms." Someone looked at him in surprise. "Are you by any chance the one?" Bondarenko asked, making a characteristic gesture with his finger near his temple. "There is so much going on here, and he's talking about tractors." "I am in good health." "By the way, each of us should look ahead," answered the loader. "The war will be over. We'll have to start a lot of things from scratch." "It is still a long way off. First we have to defeat the fascists." Bondarenko did not give up. "Comrade Sergeant," Sevastyanov suddenly appealed, "can we change the firing position?" "Where else?" "Over there behind that tank," the gunner showed, standing up. 200 meters away from our trench, the enemy vehicle, hit during the reflection of the last attack, was still burning. Thick black smoke from it, billowing, flowed on the ground. Behind this veil, of course, it would be difficult for the enemy to detect us. Convenient cover supported the gunner, Alexey Ivanovich. The temptation was indeed great. I thought, why not take the initiative? Besides, our trench is no longer a shelter. The gun emplacement and slits were half covered with earth. The birch block was scattered in many places during bombing. And there. The fascists wouldn't hit their tank. They wouldn't even think of it. I made up my mind. At my command, the crew quickly rolled the gun to a new position. And then the platoon commander, Junior Lieutenant Miniev, appeared from nowhere. He positioned himself next to me in the funnel and asked, "Who guessed?" "Sevastyanov." "That's good." "Do." And I confess, I was expecting a scolding from him for self-rule. Then we endured another fierce bombardment and no less fierce artillery raid. And the fifth attack of the day began. I see 3 tanks moving on the gun of Senior Sergeant Ovchar at once. He shot down 1 machine, but the enemy was not left in debt, took out half of the calculation. And now the 2 remaining tanks are quickly going to his firing position. The head one is very close. The barrel of its gun, with a thickened muzzle brake at the end, turns threateningly. A few more moments, and the multi-ton Tiger will roll up on the trench. Into his side, I suggested to the gunner. Sevastyanov merged exactly with the gun. A second passes, a second. A shot. Tongues of flame danced on the armor of the enemy machine. It's burning. The third Tiger at that time abruptly turned around and rushed at us. I can see how its wide tracks are crushing bushes, grass crashing into the ground. It is already 20 meters away from us, no more than 20 meters. Sevastyanov fires, but the shell only sparks on the frontal armor. The Tiger's cannon also spits out fire. Fortunately, the shell, drilling the air, whistled above us. Now only moments decide our fate. If we don't have time to shoot again, it's the end. One of our neighbors is ahead of us. A shot in the side with a sub-caliber shell stops the tank. It is Smoky. Calmed down, exhaled Alexei Ivanovich, and with the back of his hand wiped off the sweat from his face. Yes, indeed, in battle everything is decided by seconds. In the second half of the day, the situation became sharply more complicated. Nazi tanks, having cut the road, came to the forest and then bypassed the height. The battle is now rattling in our rear. The battery was ordered to withdraw, said the platoon commander. We're dismounting. We're marching. When we arrived at the new place, it was already noticeably dark, but in the twilight even more clearly seen the glow of fires on the horizon. Somewhere muffled murmur tank engines and occasionally heard short machine gun bursts. The first day of our fight with enemy tanks on the fiery line, the name of which is now world-famous Kursk bulge, was coming to an end. Lieutenant Chernyshenko showed us the firing position. Now we have only 3 guns in the battery. In the center was placed the calculation of Senior Sergeant Fyodor Simakov, on the right mine, on the left Sergeant Nikolai Rodionov. By the way, we took positions prepared in advance. Someone, apparently, has already made an effort for us. Comrade Sergeant Bezabotnov called me, adjusting the platen under the frame. But we got into our old trench. No way. Look at this shrubbery. Alexei Ivanovich continued. I was the one who cut it down. I was clearing it by your order. But the terrain is really familiar in some way. There ahead darkens the broken line of the landing, dividing in two a wide field. On the right an anti-tank ditch, covering the approaches to the battery. To the left a steep cliff, and further on the slope of the height. And I remembered a week ago we were preparing firing positions here. It turns out that we didn't shovel the ground for nothing then, Sevastyanov says in a satisfied voice. At least now we'll have some rest. But there was no rest. They brought ammunition. The soldiers spent 2 hours carrying heavy boxes of shells. So much for a rest. Then the whole squad gathered at the gun. In front, and to the left, the battle was rumbling in the darkness. Every now and then flares flew up into the sky. The bastards have broken through, Bondarenko said brokenly. It's nothing, boy, it's not the 41st year, Alexei Ivanovich answered. They won't let the fascists go far anyway. They will stop them. We have enough reserves, Kozlov supported him. In the middle of the night we were thoroughly refreshed. Petty Officer Kizelev brought at once and lunch and dinner, and after that platoon and gun commanders gathered Lieutenant Chernyshenko. He summarized the day. The battery destroyed 9 tanks. The lieutenant wrote down 2 vehicles on our account. We returned to the calculation together with the platoon commander. We started to get ready for bed. The first to lie down was Junior Lieutenant Maniev. Putting someone's duffel bag under his head, he stretched out to his full height at the bottom of the trench. Before falling asleep, he handed me his wristwatch. He said, "Nosov, you'll be the first on duty. Wake me up in an hour, and I'll take over." And almost immediately he snored. I stood up, leaned against the bumper of the trench, began to look ahead into the night. Machine guns were still tapping somewhere, explosions were heard occasionally, and the muffled rumble of tank engines, muffled by distance, was heard. And under these familiar front sounds I involuntarily drifted back in my thoughts to that distant November dawn of the 42nd year, which changed my whole life. It was still quite dark outside. My friend and I, shivering from the cold, are hurrying to work. Sharp wind from the Kliazma tears the hollow of my summer coat, fractures the visor of my cap. I warmed up in the shop, at the machine. About a year I have already been working at this plant. I've mastered the specialty of a turner, but my soul is still not in place. I want to go to the front, but they won't let me. And suddenly, in the middle of the working day, the timekeeper came up to me and handed me a summons. To the military enlistment office. My heart trembled with joy. I guessed why I was being summoned. After all, for a year and a half I have been asking to be drafted into the army and sent to the front. Will my wish come true? The next day I went to the military enlistment office. There was a crowd of men and young men of draft age waiting for their turn. I was one of the first to be called up. At first I went from one doctor to another, then I was sent to the military commissar. The young commander with a sleeper in his buttonhole looked me over carefully from head to toe, looked over the results of the medical examination and decisively said, "To the artillery." I left the office inspired with good luck. To the artillery. To the god of war. One could only dream of such an assignment. During the time left before being sent to the unit, I went to the village, visited my relatives, then came to the shop, warmly said goodbye to my comrades. My foreman Sergei Grigorievich, shaking hands, gave a friendly admonition. Fight, Vanya, in our way, in the workers' way. In a word, don't be an asshole. ... I in the morning. Ahead, behind the distant heights, broke out frequent artillery and rifle and machine gun fire. The rumble of tank engines began to approach. "It's starting again," Bezobotnov said, wiping his inflamed eyes. Yesterday Alexei Ivanovich had been concussed, and now he limps a little and occasionally jerks his head. But he stubbornly refuses to leave his position. On all my insistent requests to go to the medical center, he answers, "I'll heal faster with the guys." "The bastards are pushing him," Vladimir Sevastyanov added. "He is wounded." He presses his bandaged hand to his chest, but like Bezobotnov, he doesn't want to go to the rear. Frankly speaking, in my heart I'm even glad of it. Sevastyanov is an excellent gunner, you can't go to waste with him. Yesterday he proved it by shooting down 2 tigers. The men of the squad are still sitting in the gap on empty shell boxes. Calm, focused. During the night they slept a little. A short rest has noticeably restored their strength. "They are rushing to a Boyan," Kozlov suggested. "Nothing. They will soon slow down," Alexei Ivanovich said with conviction. Meanwhile, the rumble of battle was getting closer by the minute. At our firing position suddenly burst one shell, followed by another. The artillery bombardment has begun. To the guns. Gave a command at that time platoon leader. Sevastyanov was the first to rise. After him easily jumped out of hiding Bezobotnov, took the place of the lock. Kozlov stood behind the loader. Bondarenko opened the box, began to wipe the shells. I brought binoculars to my eyes. Through the murky veil of smoke and dust, optics brought closer a wide field, on which the battle was already rumbling in full swing. Nazi tanks and self-propelled vehicles were approaching the heights with an iron clang. I have chosen the target. It's a squat tank with a long-barreled gun. He is far ahead of the other vehicles, skillfully bypasses funnels, often changes the direction of movement, trotting to the right, then left. Sometimes it stops for a moment, and then you can see a tongue of flame bursting out of the barrel of his gun. Hit a Viper, I thought with hatred about the fascist mechanic driver, and gave a preliminary command. The numbers of the calculation quickly fulfilled it. Sevastyanov pointed the gun, reported on readiness. I made a wave of my hand. A shot rumbled. The shell exploded just to the right of the target. I made a correction. The gunner took aim again. Another shot. But the squat tank, as if enchanted, continued to move forward. Sevastyanov became visibly nervous. Is it impenetrable or what? Aim at the undercarriage, I advised the gunner. Enemy tanks and self-propelled vehicles, leading the infantry, meanwhile, have already approached our front line. Machine guns banged relentlessly. The fascists, who were running after the tanks, scattered, began to fall, hiding in craters, folds of the terrain. But what could the machine gunners do with the steel hulks? Some of them have already broken into the front line, began to iron the trenches of our infantry. Meanwhile, Sevastyanov kept the impenetrable tank in his sight. At that time it just pecked the cannon forward, hitting a huge crater. Our gunner immediately turned into a blob of tension. He was waiting for the tiger to get out of the obstacle that he had inadvertently encountered. and when the grey bottom was exposed on the rise, he instantly fired. The tank froze for a moment, then rolled back into the funnel and smoked. "So them, the bastards," shouted Kozlov, giving another shell. The battle began to take an undesirable turn for the Hitlerites. Only in our sector of fire 4 enemy vehicles were already burning. Finally, the rest of the tanks could not stand it and turned back. "Stop firing." Lieutenant Chernyshenko commanded. "Well, we worked well," Alexei Ivanovich said, somehow very ordinary, sitting down on a shell crate. "And now, I think, and a smoke would be good." He took out a kit set and began to roll a cigar. The anti-tank gun is a collective weapon. It can fully demonstrate its combat capabilities only in the hands of a well-coordinated and trained calculation. However, in battle it happened that the gun had only one artilleryman. But even in this case it was not silent. Fulfilling the combat task, the survivor continued to act for the entire crew. So did, for example, the gunner, Sergeant Georgy Sosnin. I remember, in the midst of the battle, the platoon commander Junior Lieutenant Miniev came running to our position. Heavily translating his breath, he ordered, "Nosov, urgently allocate 2 men with me." The second calculation was cleanly put down. Bezobotnov, Bondarenko. "Yes," simultaneously answered the named soldiers and rushed after the junior lieutenant. In the evening, when Bezobotnov and Bondarenko returned to the calculation, we became aware of the feat of Komsomol Sosnin. "That's it, Comrade Sergeant. The mission is accomplished. Unfortunately, the Tiger gun was blown to pieces. With a dummy. It was a miracle that Pyotr and I survived," Alexei Ivanovich reported, wiping his wet forehead. The junior lieutenant was concussed, he couldn't speak. They took him to the Sanbat. He stopped and finished with admiration, and Georgy Sosnin did well. For 2 days of fighting 6 tanks, wrote off the Wehrmacht's account. As a hero. He burned the last Tiger alone. All wounded, but he didn't leave the gun. Only now they've sent him to the rear. Will they cure him? Sure. He should be back in a couple months. They'll fix it up, it'll be as good as new. After that, the details came out. On the first day of the battle, Sosnin's gunnery crew shot down 3 tanks, and the artillerymen were no less courageous the next day. Their gun was on the left flank of the battery, where the fascists directed their main blow. Here they managed to come closest to our firing positions. In the first hours of the battle, the calculation burned the Tiger, but the artillerymen also suffered losses. Only gunner and loader Private Shutov were left at the gun. The enemy pressed on. Sosnin hit another tank with an accurate shot, but Shutov was killed, and the lieutenant himself was wounded. Having lost 2 vehicles, the fascists withdrew. A hail of shells fell on the firing position of the hero. Sosnin was wounded again, but even after that he did not leave the gun. In the renewed attack he loaded and fired himself. He burned the 3rd tank, and only after that the junior lieutenant and Bezobotnov with Bondarenko came to him. Later, Georgy Alexandrovich Sosnin was awarded for this feat the Order of Patriotic War of the I degree. Last night the battery changed firing positions. Until dawn the calculations chiselled stony ground on the slope of a low visible height, overgrown with sparse shrubbery. In front of us a ravine, behind it a rye field, further a ridge of small heights. On the left, in a kilometre, half-burned settlement Chapayev. For its ruins for the 3rd hour there is a fierce battle. Hitlerites finally managed to squeeze our units, and now their tanks and infantry are coming at us. We prepared to fire. But suddenly the Nazis stopped the attack and turned back in panic. What's the matter? And what is that rolling rumble on the right? I looked in that direction, and everything became clear. Our 30 checkers. They were rapidly coming at the enemy, firing on the move and with short stops. And again the rumble. Now from behind. Or rather, not even a rumble, but a deafening rumble, as if the horizon behind us had split into pieces. Dozens of rockets flew over our heads, drawing straight lines of fire across the sky. Among the mingled enemy battle orders soared dark black pillars of ruptures. Several Nazi tanks were on fire. What a blow! Sevastyanov shouted admiringly, watching the work of the Katyushas. We should give them. Bastards, such a treat more often, Kozlov added in his tone. They would sooner wise up. The order came to withdraw from the occupied positions. The battery began to move after the advancing infantry and tanks. We had to delay. There was no tractor. Just before that, Lieutenant Chernyshenko had sent it for ammunition. We waited. In the middle of the day, it finally showed up. The driver, Degtyarev, black from soot with burned eyelashes, nonchalantly reported. The task is completed, Comrade Sergeant. Where did you get so lucky? Looking at the driver with surprise, Bondarenko asked. Degtyarev, as if not hearing the question, remained silent. At my command, the crew began to attach the gun to the tractor. That, like the driver, was also unrecognizable. The right corner of the side was charred, the paint was chipped, blistered. The cab and hood were riddled with shrapnel. You got a ride? Bezobotnov doubted the tractor. The main thing, Alexei Ivanovich, is that the engine is intact, Degtyarev answered him, and the wheels too. But what happened to our tractor? Only 2 days later, we finally learned about the courageous act of our comrade. The regiment's vehicles, loaded with ammunition, were returning to their positions. And at that time, fascist planes came upon the column, began to bomb and fire at it from machine guns. In the back of Degtyarev's car, along with shells, there was a barrel with fuel. A shrapnel hit it. Gasoline ignited. In this difficult situation, Pyotr Efimovich was not confused. Having stopped the tractor, he jumped into the back and began to knock down the fire, which was already getting closer to the shell boxes. The flames burned his hands and face, but Degtyarev, ignoring the infernal pain, continued to extinguish. He managed to drop the barrel, and thus prevented the explosion of shells. Soon we caught up with the battery. It was advancing directly in the fighting order of infantry. We took the place indicated by Lieutenant Chernyshenko. The battle was for the village. The fascists fiercely resisted. Then their tanks went into counterattack. Our 30 Chekars rushed to meet them. Several dozens of cars from both sides came together in a deadly engagement. Not far from us stopped a T-34 tank. Hit. Yes, its armor went up in flames. Then the smoke grew thicker. Are the boys really going to burn? Sevastyanov shrieked. I wish I could help. On the order of Lieutenant Chernyshenko, to the tank rushed Bezobotnov, Kozlov and Instructor Kizelev. They ran up to the car just at the moment when the tanker fell out of the top hatch on the armor. His clothes were smouldering. But he, not paying attention to it, jumped to the ground and rushed to the front of the tank. The artilleryman followed his example. All together pulled out of the hatch mechanic driver. But he, unfortunately, was already dead. Through the landing hatch helped to get out 2 more crew members. The instructor dressed their wounds and took them to the rear. And we soon moved forward again. Together with infantry and tanks, we broke into the outskirts of the village. We had to work a lot. Hitlerites had a lot of firing points here. And here are the first prisoners. They are led by a young, cheerful sergeant. His head is bandaged, but on the dusty face the triumph and joy of the winner. He holds a machine gun at the ready, shouts, Schnell, schnell, Aryans, superhumans. The morning began with artillery preparation. For 30 minutes the cannonade rattled on and on. Then the tanks and infantry went on the attack. They knocked the Nazis from the hastily occupied the previous day and began to push them further. I was suddenly summoned to the battery commander. Lieutenant Chernyshenko met me friendly, greeted me by the hand. He was obviously excited about something. He ordered me to follow him. We ran or even crawled to one of the high rises. Ahead we could see a settlement of some kind. But which one? The lieutenant took out a map and beckoned me to him. I moved closer and looked at the point he had indicated. So this is? Yes, Cherkasskoye village. There 3 months ago we fought with enemy tanks. It was just me and my lieutenant, We blew up our gun and withdrew with the infantry to Ryasnoye. It was then that Chernyshenko promised we'll come back here, Nosov. We did. That's why the lieutenant called me. Well, it's a very pleasant reminder. We started to return, but at that moment shells began to burst at altitude. Lieutenant Chernyshenko, who was walking ahead, suddenly fell down. I rushed to him. "Pick me up," quietly asked the battery commander. "I want to look at this village again." I fulfilled his request. He looked at me, smiled, and suddenly sagged heavily in my arms. Alexei Matveevich was an exceptionally strong-willed commander and a skillful educator. He was somewhat abrupt but forgiving, but he never pulled people for trifles, and if he did, it was always for a cause. Under his command the battery went with battles not 100 kilometers. Is it easy to lose such a commander? Looking now at his deadened face, I felt my throat spasm, and tears came to my eyes. I returned to the squadron and told the men the sad news. Wow, I had been in such trouble and stayed alive, and here by an accidental shell, said Alexei Ivanovich sorrowfully. Fate. Who gets what, said someone. Come on. It doesn't suit our lieutenant. He fought near Leningrad, and with us. A man didn't spare himself, he went into the thick of it, and you fate. Bezobotnov cut him short. The commander of the control platoon, Junior Lieutenant Tarabrin, who temporarily took over the battery, decided to salute in memory of Chernyshenko volley fire from all guns. At the enemy. Let the fascists know that for every crime they will be inevitably punished. Slowly evening twilight thickens. And even more slowly the heat is subsiding. We hide from the stifling heat in a crevice. It's not so bad under the ceiling. Only the castle's Bezobotnov keeps watch. The rest of the squad smokes, and hands disperse the blue smoke. There's a lull at the front now. Relative, of course. The enemy has been thrown back, as it was explained to us, to the initial positions from which he began the offensive. But he's not resigned to it. He occasionally counterattacks. Today, however, did not interfere. We have a guest, the commander of the radio department of the battery, Sergeant Dmitry Prokhorov. Liaison men are knowledgeable people. They're always near their superiors. That's why they are always aware of events, or at least pretend to be aware. And now the sergeant, unbuttoning the collar of his uniform, puffing a cigarette, tells us in detail about the feat of the 4th Battery. We also already know something. In any case, that the other day it fought with the superior forces of the enemy. And now from the radio operator's story the details of that battle are emerging. In the evening the calculations of the 4th Battery changed firing positions and pulled up closer to the front line, to the height of 229.8. As usual, they prepared the trenches until deep into the night. And under the morning, tired of work, lay down to rest, leaving only observers. At dawn, the fascist machine gunners managed to squeeze our infantrymen by a sudden attack and went directly to the firing positions of the battery. Deprived of infantry cover, its commander, Lieutenant Tarakov, organized a circular defense. The enemy was met by artillery and machine gun fire and, having suffered significant losses, rolled back. But in an hour everything was repeated again. This time the battery moved up to an infantry battalion with 16 tanks. Courageous defenders of the height did not falter, bravely entered into an unequal battle. The battery commander ordered to let the Nazi tanks as close as possible and to hit for sure. And when the enemy vehicles were no more than 500 meters away, he gave the command to open fire. One tank caught fire, then the second, the third. 2 more burst into flames. But Hitlerites did not stay in debt. A hail of shells and mines fell on the height. Bleeding, artillerymen fell at the guns. And fascist tanks and infantry came closer and closer to the height. They even managed to bypass the battery from the rear. Now the battery fought surrounded, surprising the enemies with unwavering steadfastness. On the slopes of the height 11 cross cars were already burning, dozens of fascists' corpses were lying, and still Hitlerites continued to press. Soon the situation on the battery was extremely difficult. Many calculations were out of service. Lieutenant Terakov was killed. Almost all guns were damaged, ammunition was running out. But the surviving artillerymen continued to hold the height. To rescue the battery in trouble, our command decided to undertake a counterattack with available infantry forces supported by artillery. Fortunately, it was successful. Our soldiers broke into the heights and rescued the artillerymen. Holding our breath, we listened to the ingenuous story of Sergeant Prokhorov, admiring the courage and bravery of our comrades in arms. "The Commissar is coming," Alexei Ivanovich suddenly warned. The soldiers stopped smoking, began to put themselves in order. I got up, went to meet the Commissar, so we still by old habit called the deputy commander of the regiment on the political part of Major Shevardin. Accepting my report, he came up, said hello, sat down on a shell crate. Squinting his eyes, looked at us carefully, he asked. "Well, what are you talking about here?" "About the 4th Battery, Comrade Major," I reported. "Well, it's a good thing. On their example, we all need to learn how to beat the fascists. Heroes." The conversation started again. Major added what Sergeant Prokhorov had missed, told us about the latest events at the front. At the same time, he emphasized that we have so far accomplished the immediate task: stop the Nazis, thwarted their plan to defeat our troops in the Kursk Bulge. Now, the most difficult tasks are ahead to continue the liberation of the Soviet land from the Nazi invaders. "And when forward, Comrade Major?" Sevastyanov inquired. "As if you don't know yourself." Mikhail Avksentievich smiled slyly. "And reassured we'll move soon, get ready." Predictions of the deputy polite came true. About a week later, we went on the offensive. The offensive, launched by the Soviet troops in early August, developed successfully. In the capital of our motherland, Moscow, soon sounded the first artillery salute in honor of the liberators of Oral and Belgorod. Our battery is now almost constantly on wheels. Now it is the end of the night, and we are still dusting along the country road. On both sides of it stick out the charred hulks of tanks, self-propelled vehicles, broken cars, mangled guns, mortars. Leads us 22-year-old battery commander Lieutenant Fyodor Shatilov. Slightly above average height, with a pleasant smiling face, he, despite his youth, enjoys unquestionable authority among the artillerymen. The battery commander rides ahead of the column, often stops. He gets out of the car, looks at the map, checking with the terrain. At dawn, we approached a village scattered on a slope. We turned off the road to the right into a clover field. And then our tractor suddenly shook. There was an explosion. "Stop. Stop. Where the hell are you going?" A fighter with a mine detector rushed to us, cursing desperately. "Were you asleep or what?" Shatilov attacked him. "What sleep, Comrade Lieutenant?" "All night long we've been making passes in the minefield." "Pointers should be placed," Alexei Ivanovich remarked to him. "And you should keep your eyes open." The sapper found himself. "And don't take a wrong turn. There are the pointers." "Who can see them in the dark?" Bezobotnov was embarrassed. Our driver Dick Jardev got out of the cab, looked at the car, said with regret, "We've had enough. We are horseless again. It's good that at least we didn't run into an anti-tank shell. That would have blown them to pieces." Nosov, hook the gun to the Willis, ordered the battery commander, and reload the shells into the tractor of the second calculation. We quickly carried out his order, and the column moved forward again. Now, on the passage through the minefield, we were led by a sapper. Behind the village, in the garden, the battery took a firing position. In front, on the heights, the enemy was entrenched. Our shells fell on him. Encouraged by the fire support, the infantry entrenched near the village went on the offensive. The fascists began to withdraw. Soon we withdrew too. And again we stopped at the edge of a sparse grove. Here in shallow trenches lay a group of soldiers. "The fascists are ahead," a sergeant with the Red Star Order on his faded uniform warned us. His left hand rested on a bandage. Almost all other soldiers of the group were bandaged. "Why don't you go to the rear?" asked Sergeant Sevastyanov. First we'll visit home, he answered. In the village ahead, my house. People are lucky, Bondarenko envied sincerely. What a thing to do. To visit his wife in the middle of the war. We don't know yet if it will be lucky, Kozlov said cautiously. The battery commander ordered to prepare the guns for direct fire. And while the soldiers unhooked the guns from the tractors, we, the commanders of the calculations, crawled behind Lieutenant Shatilov to the crest of the height. The following picture appeared to our eyes. In front of our infantry lay down, conducting a sparse fire. Further a gully, a field. On the hillside is a village. On its outskirts the enemy is entrenched. Through binoculars you can see trenches, wire fences. Dense smoke is drifting over the village, several houses are burning. A windmill standing on the outskirts of the village is burning. Fiery tongues of flame lick the cone-shaped structure, rushing on its roof, on the spread wings. While the crew rolls out the cannon to the firing position, I scrutinize the terrain in the sector of intended fire. At the mill I find a machine gun. Having estimated the distance to it, I determine the sight and angle meter. And quickly to the calculation. I give the command. Open fire. Nearby almost simultaneously sounded gunshots of Sergeants Nikolai Rodionov and Fyodor Simakov. Machine gun at the windmill choked, silenced a few more firing points. Our infantry rose to the attack. The sergeant wounded in the arm went forward with his men. The battery withdrew from its positions and moved towards the village. On the outskirts of the village again met familiar infantrymen. They stood with stern faces near one of the burned huts. On the ground lay their commander. He was dead. So our sergeant reached home, one of the soldiers said bitterly, raising his moistened eyes at us, but he didn't find his family, and he was killed on the doorstep of his native hut. After a few days of offensive, our battery was already near Boromli. Early in the morning we skipped through its quiet streets, crossed a small river, and stopped in the middle of the field. The wheat expanse swaying in the wind reminded us of the sea. The soldiers got out of the truck. We didn't have time to clean it. Sevastianov sighed sorrowfully, taking a few ears with crumbling grain in his hand. The gun to the height, the car to the shelter. Ordered at this time Junior Lieutenant Miniev. The driver of the tractor, Dnieper, hesitated. He, a farmer, who knew the true price of hard peasant labour, was sorry to ruin the wheat. "Why are you hesitating?" "Let's go," shouted the platoon commander. Dnieper quacked, climbed into the cab and carefully, as on a rickety plank, drove his tractor over the wheat field. At altitude we unhitched the gun. The position was excellent. The surrounding terrain was visible for several kilometres around. Ahead of us was an embankment of a railroad track. Our infantry was entrenched there. On the right a ridge of heights, overgrown with small woods. On the left the river Boromlia. Above it was still smoking morning fog. Battery Commander Lieutenant Shatilov this time personally arranged each gun. The first platoon on the right side of the road, the second on the left. Giving the order, the lieutenant once again warned the commanders of calculations. Trenches equipped in full profile. Possible counterattack of tanks. When the sun finally crept out from behind the horizon, breakfast was brought to the battery. Having received their portions of buckwheat porridge, the soldiers sat down on the damp berm. Aluminum spoons clattered against the edges of the wooks. The most nimble were already shoveling out the remains of the porridge from the bottom, when a group of fascist planes appeared. Castle Bondarenko jumped into the trench, put his palm on his forehead. "The bitches won't let us eat like human beings," he said with resentment. "Maybe it will pass?" Alexei Ivanovich echoed. "Hardly likely," said Kozlov, and also took cover in the gap. At first it seemed that the bombers had passed by. "It seemed to have passed," Sevastianov sighed with relief. "And I was mistaken." The planes at that time made a combat turn and rushed to altitude. The bombing began. Then artillery fire. The bursts of shells and mines were still rumbling, and the team had already put us to the guns. On the right, from the ridge of heights, Nazi tanks were already sliding down. They were moving straight at us. Behind the tanks in full height was a thick chain of machine gunners. Tanks on the right. Battery to the battle. The crews deployed the guns and opened fire. 2 cars immediately caught fire. The others, slowing down, returned fire. Suddenly, 6-barrel mortars hit the heights. The blast wave threw me aside and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, I saw Junior Lieutenant Miniev and Yuri Kozlov at the gun. It on the right, shouted to the platoon gun number. With difficulty, I lifted up. Overcoming dizziness and nausea, I crawled to help my comrades, but Sevastianov ran up to the gun before me. Allow me, he repeated, wiping the junior lieutenant from the sight. I'll give him now. The platoon commander stood aside, giving way to the gunner. The gunner took aim nimbly. He fired twice in succession, but missed. And the steel hulk, there it was, almost right next to him. And then on its way, as if from under the ground, grew a severely wounded assistant gunner Shutov. He threw a grenade. The tank, losing the track, turned around, put up the side. This time Sevastianov's shot was accurate. Having lost several cars, the Nazis withdrew. And again shells and mines began to burst at the firing position. Kozlov fell, bleeding. I crawled up to him. I hastily tore the individual bag, began to bandage him. Yuri was bracing himself, holding back a groan. Large drops of sweat appeared on his pale face. Something's burning in my lower back, he complained. I rolled him over onto his back. Yes, the shrapnel had hit him here too. It's a good thing it didn't hit his spine. That would have been the end of it. But that's it. I bandaged him up, cheered him up. It's all right. You'll live to be 100 years old. You'll even reach Berlin. He guessed. Yuri was indeed cured and returned to the ranks. Victory Day met in Berlin. Meanwhile, the battle continued. The Nazis managed to squeeze our infantry units. We also withdrew behind the river and strengthened on the heights south of the village Boromlir. With each battle we were getting closer to the Dnieper. Mirgorod was memorable. That day the battery stopped on its outskirts. We were waiting for ammunition and fuel. We rested in a cherry orchard. Yellowed leaves were falling on the grass, which was green, but already covered by the first night frosts. Nosov, there's a meeting now, Lieutenant Sigalov, the regimental commissar, warned me. So today my fate will be decided. My heart thudded. There were 12 communists in the battery, not more. They gathered near our gun, sat right on the ground. Everyone has government awards on their uniforms. Bravely fighting party members. For the fighters, they always serve as an example of impeccable fulfillment of military duty. Take at least Staff Sergeant Fedor Simakov. In one of the last battles, a wheel of his gun was knocked off by a direct hit of a shell. The gun tilted, and enemy tanks continued to advance. The commander of the calculation was not confused. He ordered the men to put some shell boxes under the carriage and continued firing. In such a position they managed to hit one more fascist tank. And such examples of courageous behavior of communists in battle we have many. That's why non-partisan fighters and commanders always strive to be like them. By the beginning of the meeting came Deputy Regimental Commander Major Shevedin. Mikhail Avksentievich was from that category of political workers who not only knew well the needs and concerns of soldiers, but also could inspire them to exploits by personal example. I remember that in one of the battles, at its most critical moment, he appeared at our firing position. He said just a few very ordinary words. "We have to hold out, guys. The regiment command is very hopeful about the 2nd battery." But he was with us till the end of the battle. And it was necessary to see with what courage the calculations met the next attack of the enemy. We saw the deputy commander was with us. He did not bend under the hail of shells and mines. That day the battery shot down 10 fascist tanks. The meeting was opened by Sergeant Rodionov, the battery commander. He read out my statement. I asked the party organization of the unit to accept me as a member of the All-Union Communist Party. I undertake to exterminate the Nazi invaders until their complete defeat. I stood up, looked at the concentrated faces of those present. I I got even more excited. Any questions for Comrade Nosov? Asked the chairman. What other questions? Responded Lieutenant Shatilov. He fights excellently. From the praise became somehow awkward, but the battery commander nodded his head in a friendly manner, encouraging. How do you think to force the Dnieper? Suddenly asked the deputy commander. I was confused. I expected any question, but not such a question. Noticing my confusion, the major explained. What practically should be done to successfully overcome the river? On what will you force it? We will build a raft from improvised materials. We will try to be among the first to reach the opposite bank. Commendable, approved Shevardin. Let him tell us about himself, suggested one of the communists. What is there to tell? I had just turned 20. Far away in the Vladimir region is my native village of Kotnevo. I was born and grew up there. I graduated from a village school, worked on a collective farm. My mother and father, 2 sisters, remained in the village. My elder brother Yefim is at the front. In the first days of the war, one moved to the city, worked at the factory as a turner. Since November 42nd in the army. I received 2 government awards. That's all. I told my autobiography in 3 minutes. After me spoke 2 Sergeant Georgy Sosnin and Sergeant Vesely Ovchar. They spoke in favour of my acceptance. What will be other proposals? Asked the meeting party leader.